So talk a little bit about advertising rates. How would a TV station or a cable operator, what are the different ways that they charge the client?
I mean, depending on whether you're a political candidate or you're an issue group.
Let's say I'm a candidate, and
Yeah.
what about this so-called lowest unit rate that we hear about?
So yeah, I mean, if you and it's a very, I think the purpose of what stations and ownership groups try to do is try to make it harder because they want you to try to pay more. But there, and on any given what they call was a rate card, which will show you the rate for Good Morning America, for example, the LUR, which is the lowest unit charge, which is supposed to be what they charge their most favorite advertiser in their market, all the way up to a absolute clearing rate, which is you can pay it and forget it, but they also might have 5 levels in between that. So it really becomes a little bit of a guesswork maze art form and trying to figure out what level you go at to make sure that your candidate you try to clear your candidate at the lowest rate you can, while not paying too much, but also making sure that your spot runs. Because if you pay too much, then somebody else may have paid less. That becomes a problem for your candidate. If you pay too little and your spot doesn't run, then that's a problem because you missed out on a potentially valuable inventory.
Explain this concept, because most people think you go and buy a TV spot, you've got the TV spot.
So, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the president was in North Dakota. I think it was North Dakota, and he was giving a speech. And the pillow guy, the guy that does the my pillow,
yeah,
apparently was in the crowd, and he recognized that and said to him, "And the pillow guy's here. I see your ads all the time. You should be my media buyer because you must get the best rates." So the president doesn't understand how candidates buy TV within the political window. And Danny was talking about it. It's a puzzle that's difficult to figure out because
What's the political window?
Before primary, 6 days before primary, 45 days before general election is when the lowest unit rate laws apply to federal candidates. You find that most stations apply them to any candidate.
But the law was originally invented by
Federal,
by Congress to make sure that they got the lowest unit rate.
Sure. Yeah, the guys making the rules are the ones benefiting from them.
But stations will try to extend that to other candidates, even though in a lot of races, if there's a lot of big action in a media market, we've seen situations where stations won't even sell time to down candidate ballots.
Right.
Because they're not obligated to sell.
Yeah, I think they look at the economics of what's going on in their state. If demand is really, really high, you try to exclude. If demand is low, then you try to be more inclusive because it works and it will change. A station in Virginia, for example, may have a very inclusive policy this election year because the political cycle is relatively light, but in 2 years from now, it might be the opposite. They might say no state or local candidates are able to get LUR, and then you have to have that fight on a case-by-case basis.
And if I were a lawyer, I'd assume that the law or the statute was written to make it a fair playing field for federal candidates, meaning just because Danny spent 80% of the money in the presidential race, that $450 million figure, he doesn't get preferred treatment for the volume that he brings to the stations. Both candidates are treated
That
the
they
same.
have to sell.
Yeah.
They have to sell the competing candidates the inventory at the same rate. But if I come in and if I buy it early, couldn't I get a price benefit on it then?
As a candidate?
Let's say Danny bought the spot 3 weeks before it runs. And then Ben comes in 3 days and wants to buy the spot. Couldn't they sell it to Ben at a higher rate than they sell it to Danny?
I think ideally no, but a station's interpretation, some stations have the interpretation that first in, last out. So that would mean that if you only have a certain amount of spots and you have a candidate who booked it a certain amount of period of time greater than somebody else, then one candidate might be more set up to have that spot before the other candidate, thus bumping that next candidate to a higher level. And while every station has their own interpretation based on what I think it still comes down to economics, what makes sense for them economically. Because if they have the first in, last out, that means they're more likely to bump up advertisers, even in a competing race, going for the same office, that booked it later, to make sure that they get more money out of each individual spot.
But to make the point,
Yeah.
that if Danny and Ben both tried to buy that spot 3 days before it ran, the station would have to charge you the same.
Generally, yes.
And what Danny was talking about earlier is that it's a tough puzzle or tough balancing act to figure out in terms of which rate to use when you're laying in these candidate buys. If you go in too high, you might be paying more and end up with money returned to you in terms of a rebate or a refund after the election, which is something no campaign wants if they end up losing by a close margin. You don't want money back. Or if you go in too low and your spots don't clear, you're not actually delivering the audience that you told the client you're going to deliver, at least not at the cost. You might be given the opportunity to add money to clear those spots.
Since you brought that up, talk about the process of reconciliation after a campaign and the possibility of a refund.
Oh, it's miserable.
It is miserable.
It's miserable. Yeah. So the reconciliation is since we're in political advertising, we have to pay cash in advance for our advertising. So we're prepaying for any particular spot or any piece of inventory that's running on air. After it runs, an invoice is created and sent to us. And then we will double check that invoice against the order to see if it ran as intended or if there's something changed. Typically, the things are compressed into that 60-day window. A high volume of our work is done Labor Day to Election Day, meaning we don't get those invoices until close to Election Day or afterwards. So the work isn't being done until the election is over. So when we reconcile, we're checking the dollars to make sure that they were spent accordingly, and if not, we need the money back. Sometimes campaigns have other bills they need to pay, and they might rely on that money. Sometimes I've seen campaigns build in a 1% unexpected refund rate into their budgeting plans, assuming that they can pay whatever vendor with that refund money.
And if you get unexpected money back, you hope that candidate has won.
Yes. Yeah. So we ran into a case with that on the presidential race with
that's a good story.
with Ms. Clinton and Mr. Trump.
The World
the World Series. Danny and I both bought Game 7. How did you have 3 spots? I had 2 spots. I think you had 3. We found out several months after the election that the lowest rate had changed, and we each
Significantly.
Yeah, we each received 6-figure refunds back. And for me, it was less of a problem than it was for Danny.
Well, yeah, we had done that same thing which you just talked about, which is like we built in a 1% reconciliation rate, and that helped to
Yeah, okay.
Make the
that helped
go.
to make sure that we were in that range. So.
Yeah.